You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into this discussion now. The Public Service Commission is concerned by government's inability to pay service providers on time. It's calling on National Treasury to urgently find ways to fast-track the process. Public Service Commission Chairperson is Professor Somadoda Fikeni, and he joins me this evening to talk about this and other matters. Professor, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Let's start with the question over invoices. To what extent are overdue invoices in provincial departments, and why is it that it has reached these alarming levels, particularly here in Gauteng, where we sit?
Well, I do think that it is one of the most serious crises, especially when you consider that some small businesses do not have credit history and therefore do not have credit to borrow from the banks. They live off the monies they get after performing work. Mm-hmm. If they are not paid, many of them close down. And any country that values economic growth, you'll know that it's not big businesses that provide labor-intensive and sometimes even capital-intensive, work. It's those small businesses, and most countries often count on those. So when they are shut down, and most of these, the majority, it's your black people, who are still at that level of entry into the business world. The reasons for non-payment, it's sometimes poor systems in your supply chain. And sometimes it could even be cynical because we don't provide or find reasons that some people will delay until they induce somebody to make a payment for their papers to be processed. That's why we want a closer look to departments which are serial offenders in that sense. Of course, we do admit that some departments may have volumes of transactions and contracting that they are not able to manage. And that too speaks to the weaknesses of their systems and sometimes poor planning.
Talk to us then about the impact of this on service delivery.
The impact on this on service delivery is such that sometimes some of these businesses have a longer contract. They still have to continue. If they do not have the resources because of the work they've done, and they do not have cash to purchase goods for the next phase, then it means service delivery is impacted. And at times, some of these businesses may not be around or available to provide services because they will have gone under.
Yeah. You are now, as a result of this, you're calling for an overhaul of the financial management system. What specific changes do you believe that National Treasury should consider to try and improve the situation?
The first one is to make sure that there is consequence management, which would be more on a contracting level. The performance contracts, that is your Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, to say a person cannot claim, I have a good unqualified audit, therefore I need pay progression, I need promotion and so forth, but still be bad in the management of these. So in that ecosystem, that is one of the things. And National Treasury should also have serious censure for people who do not report they are defaulting on the payment of people, and even at times penalize those who, without reason, would delay the payments, because that imposes a cost on those small businesses.
Yeah.
And the issue of the central procurement system, or just the revamping of procurement systems to be a lot more efficient rather than the decentralization at a level where there is no capacity. Those are some of the options, but we're not imposing these. We're simply saying, let's revisit the whole procurement system so that if the best ideas are there, on how efficiencies can be improved, how people can pay on time, how we can transparently see when there are delays, what were the causes of delays, and punishment where there is no such clear explanation.
Yeah. Professor Fikeni, there's no way that accounting officers do not know that failure to pay service providers within 30 days is a violation of the Public Finance Management Act. Are these people being held accountable for these delays? And if so, how?
Unfortunately, in majority of cases, we have not seen, even in instances where we have recommended as such, we have not seen any strict application of discipline management in this respect, or even penalizing people who make these delays. So there seem to be protection of employees who are in this supply chain or procurement processes, wherein you find that nothing happens, and sometimes very weak, flimsy explanations are provided, whilst businesses and service providers suffer, and sometimes suffer irreparably. So that is why we are calling upon ministers, MECs, premiers, the presidency, head of government business, or even the Treasury, when it is dealing with some of these issues, to put that up front, because it is not only impacting on service delivery, but it is impacting on the prospects of country growing and on the prospects of country reducing unemployment, because those small businesses are the ones that provide the greatest volume of employment. And some of them, it pushes them into informal sector. And in the informal sector, it's very difficult for them to be paying, SARS and other things. So this has a value chain which goes against one of the priorities of the seventh administration of an inclusive growth of economy.
Yeah. And that point, Professor Fikeni, then helps us to segue to another topic, and that is that of professionalizing the public service. Recently, we saw the Minister of Public Service and Administration, Mzamo Buthelezi, declining requests from 3 ministers who wanted to appoint candidates who did not meet the minimum requirements for the specific roles that they wanted them for. How significant a development is this in advancing the professionalization of the public sector?
It is one of the most symbolic and significant steps, because if you set the tone at a leadership level, that's why we commend Minister Buthelezi for doing that. If you set that tone at the very top and among senior members of the cabinet, then those below will not even try. Because if you allow this exception becomes a norm. It becomes a slippery slope where you do not know where to stop. These advisors are the ones which occupy the most influential and consequential position. They advise ministers on how to evaluate submissions from professionals, from specialists, and therefore it cannot be more so 30 years after our democracy, when education has been free, when bursaries have been there for people who want to study, where even, people who wanted to catch up and improve, they always were there. One could deploy this argument of saying no other people the backgrounds, but 30 years on, it's a whole generation plus more when people had opportunities. And these people are going to be the ones who interface between the minister and the department, which are specialists. That cannot be.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of personal, chemistry that you want a person to come in. Let's begin to say building a professional, technically capable, and meritocratic system also means that qualifications do matter.
Well, you talk about chemistry. I wonder how vociferously that point would be argued by the political heads of these departments. And that leads to my next question. To what extent do political figureheads or ministers, to what extent does their interference hinder the effort to professionalize the public service?
Well, it would always be a factor, because if it serves them to have loyalty over competence, to have people who would keep secret to them, would be able to do what they want to do, then that would hinder professionalization. But if they begin to insist on the best of the best, because they are qualified and because they can stand toe-to-toe with professionals in their departments, then we will be making some progress in building that ethical, capable, developmental state.
Yeah. In
building that institutional capacity of the state. Remember, all studies indicate that that capacity, public service is the engine of government. And if that engine doesn't work, it doesn't matter what ideology, what policy you have, it's going to fail because you can't implement it, both to the detriment of the citizens and those coming to invest or coming to transact with the country. So it is very much important that at times some of the leaders accept the personal inconvenience for the greater good. And the issue of interference, I would say, sometimes it's not a one-way where ministers do interfere politically on their heads of departments or DGs. Sometimes you find that DGs who are politically steeped do also, try to flex their political muscle. And this professionalization is trying to create a professional, apolitical environment where political appointees or deployees in the private office are also defined in strict terms, and where interface between political figures and those who are professionals below them is well defined. There are no blurred lines. Therefore, interference would be limited in that sense.
Yeah. Final thought, Professor Fikeni. What other obstacles are there to achieving a fully professionalized public sector? And I'm thinking here particularly in terms of skills, ethics, and accountability.
Well, I do think that the one of ethics, values, and principles is probably the most fundamental. You saw that during corruption reports, during the Zondo Commission, the personal protection material scandals, all those, some of the people were well educated, technically sound, but the issue of values, the issue of ethics is the one that is being called to question. Whether in the world stage, which led to the financial crisis of 2008, creative accounting in the US, or here in our shores. So the issue of values, not just being aware of values, but being intrinsic to a point where behavioral change is, seen.
Yeah.
So the biggest challenge there is, how do you take people who are already in the system, in their thousands, who have learned the other wrong ways, and incentivize them to unlearn those wrong ways in order to relearn the new ones? Because even if you recruit new people, it's only incremental. That overhauling and the shift from compliance only into value-based approach, which complements compliance, then you'll have a perfect combination in that situation. But of course, we need to look at the whole ecosystem, from training to in-service training to integrity testing, the filters we put, the integrated system, so that a person who does wrong in one province, the biometric system will catch them when they go elsewhere, even if the panel was trying to bypass the system.
Yeah. Professor Fikeni, I'm completely done with you. but there's one niggling question that I've always wanted to ask. Do you think that workers in the public service, and I'm talking police officers, whether it be a nurse or a teacher, but if I could just focus the attention on police officers, is there a correlation between a corrupt police officer and the pay that they get? Simply put, if they were paid much bigger salaries, would the scourge of corruption still be as high?
There is no such direct correlation, whilst one should not ignore the conditions of service. But you go to different countries which may be paying far less, but still having ethical disposition. And also you go to the fact that it's not always the poorly paid police. Some of the senior police, well-resourced, are the ones who are also involved in corruption. So the issue of whether greed has conscience or has a barometer beyond which they say, I can't go beyond this point. The sadness about greed is that you may steal today 1,000 and tomorrow you wish to have 10,000. That year you want 1 million, that year you want 10 million, that year you want 1 billion. So we should not find reasons to justify, whilst improving conditions of work should actually be the focus so that people are happy and satisfied. But the issue of stealing, we've seen the rich and the poor. And sometimes the ones who lead in the stealing itself are the ones who control these networks and send the junior officials. So that in itself, I don't think the correlation would be sustained if we escort that particular logic.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni, thank you very much for your time and insights tonight. He is the chairperson of the Public Service